Oh, hey, what's up? It's Kai's. Today we're looking at the Primo Press N Go, so let's get into that. As you can see, there's 4 different styles they sell. 2 of them are pre-filled and 2 of them are empty. This is the hand-dyed. You can see the colors indicated on the top. They have 4 markers in 2 different styles, Presto style and Asian style, and a normal size and a mini size of both. Writers have been using correction pens or similar tools for a long time. Here's some awesome tags I found online. I'm not 100% sure that a metal tip was used for these, but I'm just taking a guess based on the line width, because that's one thing that's pretty consistent with all the whiteout pens is they have really thin lines, and because these are all white, that also helps me kind of guess that they're whiteout pens. So you can see there's a lot of styles that you can get with these, and that's why they're super fun to rock. But because 2 of these are empty, let's start by filling one up. We're using some whiteout fluid or some correction fluid. This is just some stuff I picked up from the dollar store. You can find this stuff pretty much anywhere. For the price range, it's honestly pretty awesome. Not super permanent, but you'll see later. Because the correction fluid is white, you can mix whatever colors you want in there and get some really nice pastel looking colors. So if you're somebody who enjoys making their own colors or just mixing up inks and paints, I think you'll really enjoy this whiteout correction fluid. I think it's definitely worth picking up if you see it anywhere. We're going to fill most of the marker up with that correctional fluid, and then we're going to add some random red fountain pen ink I bought. Didn't even come with a label. We're just going to add a few drops of this in, and then we're going to add a shaker ball. This is just to mix it up, although you'll see that I quite often forgot to mix it up. And then we're going to screw on the cap. These screw caps are opposite. They're righty loosey and lefty tighty, so keep that in mind when you're refilling these markers. Whenever you're mixing inks and paints inside of your markers, always shake them vigorously. Give them the best shaking of their life. And we're good to go. So let's take a peep at how this valve works. So there's this little metal pin that's held in place with a spring. When the spring is compressed, the ink is allowed to flow out. Here you can see that pen ink did not fully mix in yet. That just means I need to shake it more. My bad. Next up, we're going to write on some paper with them. The marker we're writing with here is the Primo Press N Go Teal. So these are their Asian style markers. This is the mini one with a 5 milliliter capacity. It has a very nice, soft, and squeezable body, and a pretty reliable tip. For the Teal Mini, you're looking at 5 milliliters and a price of $2.25. If you buy all of the Primo Press N Go separately, it'll set you back $10.09, but they do sell a pack of all 4 empty for $9.99. One of my favorite things about these Press N Gos is that you can get a little bit of line variation depending on how you use the marker. Another key characteristic of metal tips is they leave this little indent in the middle of the ink or the paint that's used. This is that hand-dyed Press N Go. These are made by 621 TY, but they're still sold by Primo. It's the same exact body as their Press N Go standard, but it's just with a homemade ink inside. According to Primo, these have been hand-filled with paints and dyes mixed in small batches. Due to this, each marker is unique in its own way and may have superficial markings. Superficial markings just means there might be a little paint on the side. For the Primo hand-dyed, you're looking at $5.99 filled, or you can buy the same exact marker body for $2.60 empty. This is their standard size, but they also have something called the Presto Mini. You can see the size comparison, and overall they both have pretty same feeling plastics, although the bigger one is a little bit more soft and squishy, so you can get a little bit of thicker squeezing out of it. Overall, this violet color is really nice. I really enjoy this. They all have kind of this pastel look. If I were to take a guess what they're filled up with, I would say it's probably just a whiteout fluid with some sort of dye. Maybe it's a little bit of magic ink in there, some sort of dark permanent ink that's added into the whiteout fluid to give it this nice pastel look. This is that Primo Presto Mini. These have a 5 milliliter capacity. The one I'm using here is their standard fill, which does not have correction fluid, but according to Primo, is filled with an industrial grade white paint that's similar to correctional fluid. Buying this filled up is at $2.49, and buying it empty is $2.25. You can see me really enjoying the way these lines write. I can't lie. The Primo Press N Go markers are honestly some of my favorites of all time. I really enjoy them. When writing with these markers, at the thinnest you're going to get a 1 centimeter, and at the thickest you can get 2.5 centimeters. Although most people do not use this line variation during their letters. To fill up our Press N Go Asian style, we're going to be using some Primo Dr. Guts Magnificent Marking Ink. Even though it's a paint, don't know why it's called an ink if it's a paint. It's called Asian style just because this is what the style of correction pens is like in Asia. Or at least that's what I believe it is. I have no idea, honestly. One of the biggest selling points of these markers is how easy they are to refill. If you've ever used a Pentel Presto correction pen, you know how much of a pain they can be to get open. So to have an easy twist open valve that doesn't leak is super impressive for these markers. You can see even this highly pigmented silver paint flows through this valve no problem. The Dr. Guts paint is a much more thicker but slower drying paint, so you can see some of the oil start to absorb into the paper to create kind of ghosting around the edge of your letters. Although that's no problem. That's not going to be a problem on any other surface, but it's just worth mentioning for you traditional artists. If you're using graffiti supplies on paper, I'm sure you already know they don't work the same. Next, we're going to move on to some surface testing. We're going to try out all these markers on a whole hue of surfaces and see how they all write. This is that standard fill with their industrial grade white paint. And the first thing you'll notice is that it lays down lines perfectly fine, but as this paint starts to dry on the glass, it immediately starts to flake up and peel off. This is interesting because none of the other paints do this. So this is the one indicator this might not be a normal correction fluid. All the names I'm writing here are my follower names, so if you want to get me to write your name, what you gotta do is make sure you're subscribed to me, leave a like on the video, and leave me a nice comment with the name you want me to write. Do those things and I'll add you to the list of names, and maybe you'll see your name in a future video. Next we got our custom color. This red is much more blended now, and you can see it has that same nice pastel color. Here's your homie reminder that I have other social medias if you want to stay in contact with me. I have 2 Instagrams and a TikTok. You can find them linked in the description. Here's that Dr. Guts, and you can see the consistency of the paint is very different than the others. The correctional fluid has a really fast dry time, so it's pretty much as quickly as it's laid down, it's dried, versus this Dr. Guts takes a minute or two to dry, so it creates a little bit more fluid, and you can see it actually drips, unlike the other ones, which, despite my tries, do not actually drip. So while these markers aren't often used as drippers, you can get them to drip depending on what you fill them up with. For fill up number 3, we're using some Steve Garvey ink. I bought this from artprimo.com, and we're not doing a full fill up, but we're just adding this to that standard fill mini Presto. The white ink was getting boring for me, and I wanted to test some of this Garvey, and I've been dying to crack it open for a video so that I can use it for myself. This stuff's a really powerful stainer and flow enhancer, and it's not as powerful as real Garvey ink. The Steve Garvey ink is a purple alcohol-based ink with a sticky resin and a low price, and it comes in a 120 milliliter bottle with a nice pour spout, so it's a lot more difficult for me to make a mess. I said difficult, not impossible. With the first test, it wasn't shaken up enough. Second test, it's a little bit more shaken up, and you can see some of that purple starts to come through. And once again, it starts to come through a little bit more. It just needed to be shaken more, but look at that really cool half blended color. Here you can see what the final color comes out to. I love the way correctional fluid looks, just the kind of pastel colors, and this Garvey is so dark that even with the whiteout, it becomes just a kind of light lilac color, not a dark purple or really light purple. That Steve Garvey is marketed as a flow enhancer, and it sure does. It slows down the dry time of this ink. It makes it a lot more fluid and drippy, which is always a super fun bonus. Okay, onto the metal surface. We're testing all the markers here. Here's the Presto Mini with the standard fill, and then we've got the hand dyed. Next up, we've got our custom blend and teal mini. Then our Dr. Guts silver in the Asian style. And then our Steve Garvey white paint blend. My camera struggles to pick up the colors on this really bright, shiny metallic surface, so I'll have to play around with my filming setup in future videos, but you kind of get the feel for it. As you can see, that Steve Garvey loves to drip. Now on our painted surfaces, first we're doing that hand mixed violet. You can see there's a little bit of bleed through from last video. Press N Gos aren't the only correction pens on the market nowadays. There's quite a few graffiti brands selling their own, but honestly I think these are some of my favorites. If you've ever worked with Pentel Prestos, you know that they can be a real pain in the butt to open, along with the dollar store whiteout pens, which have a really soft plastic that most solvents will start to melt, which can lead to painter's pockets. Meanwhile, the Art Primo Press N Gos are made with a much higher quality plastic, and I'm less worried about my solvents eating these up. But you'll see in a minute, I do have to worry about my solvents eating up the white paint on this wood. This is one of the big selling points of correction pens, is that they can write on a lot of really rough surfaces that I wouldn't really want to tag on with a marker or a mop. While these tips are very strong, they're not invincible. They quite often will get clogged up, or they'll get straight up bent out of place. If it's clogged, you can take them apart and clean them out super easy with a little bit of acetone. But if they're bent up, they can be pretty hard to fix or downright impossible. So treat them with care. I would say don't write on anything that's like a straight up brick. That's what a grog metalhead's for. Your kind of smoother stone or tiles will be totally fine. Here we're only testing out the hand-dyed, the Garvey, and the Dr. Guts on the brick. Caution warnings aside, these markers do write really well on a lot of really coarser surfaces that I wouldn't want to write on with a normal marker or mop. So that's a big bonus to them. Last but not least, we're practicing on the porous surface of this trash can. When you see the tips clogging up and they're starting to streak, that's not because of the marker, that's more because of my improper use of them. I've been writing on wet paint with them, which has a tendency to get them to clog up, so that one's a my bad. One thing that is worth mentioning is that depending on the surface you're writing on, these markers can be pretty loud to write with. So you ever trying to catch a casual spot and try and be quiet, these markers might not be the choice for you. Just imagine it, it's a metal tip, so if you're writing on some tile or some metal or some glass, it's going to create a pretty scratchy noise that might alert other people you're writing. So keep that in mind. Once again, that Steve Garvey really be dripping. Now let's move on to buff testing. This has more to do with the paint and less to do with the markers. Here we're just hitting it with just some straight up water. And the first one that starts to come off is that industrial grade white paint. That's about what I expected. None of these are going to really hold up on glass because glass is a super non-porous surface. Next up, we're hitting it with some rubbing alcohol, and immediately there's some color change, especially on that Steve Garvey. The alcohol starts to dissolve the colorant that's used in both ours and hand-dyed color. The basic fluid, though, stands up just about the same as it does to the water, which is to say it doesn't stand up very well at all. You can see with just a light bit of scrubbing, this stuff comes right off. But that's to be expected. The only way you're staying permanent on glass is with etch or a scratcher. Not to mention, the buff man's not even going to bother with trying to remove paint from glass with chemicals. He's immediately going to go for a razor blade and just scratch it all off the surface of the glass. Interestingly, the alcohol doesn't really dissolve the whiteout fluid, it just weakens it. I mean, I can scratch this stuff off with just a fingernail. This means that any passerby can scratch this stuff off of glass. Sadly, this means that any person just walking by could take their hand out and just start scratching off your tag. So if you're going to use it on glass, try and hit a window that's not going to be easy to reach, because while this stuff does survive the rain, it's not going to survive the people. Just continue to scrub it. You can see this is even a dry paper towel, and even with a dry paper towel, it just starts to scrub the stuff right on off. The buff man is going to make short work of any of this glass. You can see here's after a little bit of work, and that glass looks like nothing's ever happened to it. So next up, let's move on to that metal sheet. We're first starting with some water again, and as we start to scrub, you can see this stuff holds on a lot stronger. Some of the red and the purple dye starts to come up, but the white fluid itself doesn't. This just means that whiteout fluid is going to be able to survive the rain. With a little bit of alcohol though, it does start to pick it up, and that Steve starts bleeding again. Seeing as it's alcohol based, that does make sense. The alcohol doesn't quite dissolve the whiteout fluid, but it definitely softens it up and makes it a lot easier to take off. So while all these paints hold up a lot better on the metal than the glass, they're still not going to hold up against the buff man. A little bit more alcohol and we keep going at it. And the biggest pain is just that Steve Garvey likes to spread around and turn everything purple. But besides that, all this stuff's going to come off. And when we're done, we got a nice clean looking piece of metal. For the painted wood, we're going straight to the alcohol and we start scrubbing. Immediately the hand dyed starts to pick up, although our homemade blend does hold on just a little bit better than the hand mix. I'm not sure if that has to do with the colors or maybe just the ink that we used to dye it, because I can't quite tell if it was just the dye that was coming off or it was the correction pen and the dye that was coming off. So who knows? You can see the Dr. Guts stands up to the alcohol a lot more than the rest do. And the white paint that we used as a base coat actually starts to come up before the Guts does. For the future videos, we're going to switch up the paint we use because this stuff is not the best to test on. As far as the Steve Garvey goes, as we start to scrub it, you can see there's just a lot of purple bleeding, but that purple is still staying on. No matter how much I scrub this with alcohol, on this painted surface, there's pretty much always going to be a ghost. We're using some 2-in-1 paint and primer. This is an indoor paint, which is why it doesn't even stand up to the alcohol. We're going to do a pretty thin little coat over all of the tags, and then on half of each tag, we're going to do a thicker layer of paint. And after that, we're going to let it dry, and here's what we're looking at. The hand-dyed violet doesn't bleed through very much at all. Our homemade red ink does bleed through, it's noticeable. The Dr. Guts doesn't bleed through very much. There's a hint of metallic behind the white, but you can barely see the tag. The Steve Garvey was the only one that had ghosting through even the thicker layer of paint, so that's definitely worth noted. Also, this interior house paint has a really fast dry time, so in the future we're going to try something with a slower one. Next up is trying to buff that tile. We're going to squirt on some alcohol and then start scrubbing at it. And when I say scrubbing, I mean for real scrubbing. The alcohol is able to take off the hand-dyed and the Dr. Guts pretty easily, but that Steve Garvey is really soaked to the surface. It's not coming off. And I mean, I scrubbed this. I left some alcohol on there and let it sit for a couple of minutes and then even came back and scrubbed it. And no, this stuff's not coming off. Here's the best I could get it to look, and this is even after using a professional chemical remover. So 10 out of 10 Steve Garvey blend on the tile. Stuff's a pain to remove. You're gonna have to sand the whole surface. For the trash can, once again, the water's doing absolutely nothing. Who would have guessed it? Our paints are waterproof. The alcohol starts to take off all these paints, but immediately as the alcohol dissolves it, it's sucked right back into the porous surface of the trash can. This is a common thing that happens with a lot of porous surfaces. Even if your tag gets buffed, there might be a nice blue splotch on the wall. I wasn't going to show this, but I thought it was worth mentioning that I was able to get this stuff off. I just had to set it on the floor, cover it in some alcohol, and let it soak for a good while. Then I went out with an actual Scotch-Brite scrub brush, and with a lot of scrubbing, a lot of cut-up t-shirts, I was able to get this stuff off. But like I said, it does clog, and these things clog pretty often, which is kind of a pain. But the good thing is that they're super easy to clean out, which is what I'm going to show you as our final message for the day. So here you can see this tip is nice and crusted over it and it's not writing. All we're going to do is get a little cap of acetone. So this is just nail polish remover, 100% acetone. And all we're going to do is dip the tip in here a couple of times and let it soak. Wipe it off a few times, dip it a few times, and you can see this marker comes right back to working like nothing ever happened. If this still isn't enough and your tip is still clogged, you can actually fully take these apart and take the springs out. It's a little bit of a pain, but it does come back together just as good as before and works just as well. And look at that clean tip. You never know what this marker's been through. My overall thoughts on the markers are, I love them. I really love how these write, and they're some of my favorites. They're super easy to refill, and they're pretty cheap. Overall, the pros of these markers is that they're easy to refill. They don't often leak unless they've been really well used. They're pretty cheap for the price. They're really small and an easy thing to carry in a pocket. They're pretty versatile and can write on a lot more surfaces than your standard marker. And they're super easy to clean up if they do have a problem. Which leads us on to the cons, which is that they clog up pretty often. The tips get pretty scuffed up and bent, and they have a really small carry capacity. You can't put a lot of fluid in here and they empty out really fast. Which could be a con in some situations, but for me personally, I actually consider that a pro because it lets me try out a lot more different ink combinations and not be worried about making really big batches. If you've never used a correction pen, you're missing out. They're super fun to use, and they're some of my favorites to write with. And these Art Primo ones are pretty high quality and pretty cheap, so I couldn't recommend them enough. If you do end up buying some, send me some pictures on Instagram. I want to see the tags you catch. Otherwise, thanks for watching, homies. You can click right here to subscribe if you haven't already. I mean, if you haven't already subscribed, what are you doing? And you can click right here to watch another video. Love you, homies. Thanks for watching.